Thank you, Susie. Thank you all for coming. Pete, really good to see you. Congratulations on this wonderful, wonderful book. What a pleasure. 25 years, your experience with China, from river town to other rivers. What was the first impression when you walked into a Chinese classroom again in 2019 in Sichuan?
Yeah, I mean, I had wondered what it would be like, because I taught only for 2 years, 96, 98 in Sichuan, and that was a very different time in China. I think from that first experience, there was actually a lot of very physical impressions from teaching. This is partly because in those days, the classrooms were neither heated nor air conditioned, so you were very much in the Sichuan climate. So it was hot at the beginning of the semester and got quite cold. But also just the students. As a teacher, you sort of feel the physicality of your students. Most of my students in the 90s had come from the countryside, usually from pretty remote places.
Mm-hmm.
They were very small. Some of them later commented that maybe we had meat once or twice a month. They were, I remember noticing the first winter that I taught there that they got a lot of chilblains, these kind of sores they get on their hands and often on their ears. That's from, being in unheated conditions. Also, they would wash their clothes by hand. And I also remember in that early years, like Adam Meyer was the other volunteer who was with me, and we sort of memorized the names by their clothes because they wore the same thing every day pretty much, because they had to wash those clothes by hand and they didn't have much to start with. And so you did have a sense of, that these people were coming out of poverty in many cases. Going back in 2019 was completely different. I would show my Sichuan University students a picture of me with those Fuling students in my first semester that I taught. And I kind of towered over all of the people I taught, and I'm 5'9", and the Chuanda students would laugh at that because most of the boys were taller than me, and a lot of the girls, so physically they were so different. These were city kids, and China had developed so much. There was actually in 2020 there was an article in a study in the Lancet that came out, the medical journal, that out of 200 countries, China had experienced the largest increase in boys' height and the third largest increase in girls' height since 1985. And the average Chinese 19-year-old male is 3.5 inches taller. So really just a radical change. And that is a very visceral, we talk about how many people were lifted out of poverty and how things changed in China, but that was something that really hit me at the physical level.
Right. So when you first went to China in 1996 with Adam Meyer, that was a Peace Corps. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that later because this is no longer a celebrated program because of the geopolitical tensions between U.S. and China. You left China and then came back to the U.S., went back to China again, and then left again and went to Egypt. So that was during 2011 when the Egyptian Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, started. And why did you want to go back to China to teach again? How was that decision made?
I had always, Rivertown was published in 2001. By that time, I was already working in Beijing as a journalist, and so I didn't teach again in any of, after leaving Fuling and after leaving the Peace Corps. But I was in close touch with all of my former students, and we sort of started this correspondence, first by mail and then eventually by email and phone and so on. And so over the years, I just had this idea that it would be interesting to go back and sort of talk, do interviews with a lot of them. We had been corresponding, and I would visit. But I thought it would be nice to go back and do sort of more systematic study of what's happened to to them over the 20 or so years. But I also thought it'd be interesting to teach. And I had a great experience teaching in the 90s, and I thought it would be fascinating to go back. And, the idea of doing it one generation later was interesting to me. So roughly 20, 25 years. It also made sense for my wife Leslie and I because our daughters at that point would be about 9 years old, and we felt like we wanted them to learn Chinese, and they could be in a Chinese school and do that. So it just made sense.
So you went back, moved back to China, and you ended up being Scoopy, Chengdu University, Sichuan University, Pittsburgh Institute. How did that decision come about, and why did you end up? You were going back to the Fuling, right?
I wanted to go back to Fuling. So originally I was going to teach there, and I talked to the university, and they were interested in having me, and I sent a formal application, and then I just didn't hear anything. So there was this kind of silence that in China, when you get that silence, you know that something's gone wrong politically, and they're not going to tell you. So we made a trip back partly to kind of figure out what was going on and what the options might be. And I met with somebody there who was well connected with party people, and basically I was told that it's because of Bo Xilai. Bo Xilai had been the head of the top official in Chongqing, the party secretary there, and this sort of explosive scandal that had happened was at like 2011 or so.
Yeah,
2012 was when he was sentenced, I think. Anyway, it was this incredible scandal that included the murder of a British businessman, but Bo Xilai had been seen at one point as a potential rival to Xi Jinping. So this whole thing had happened in Chongqing, and I was told people are just nervous. The officials there don't want to take any kind of risks. And actually what my friend told me, he's like, as long as Xi Jinping is in power, you will never teach him fooling.
But you ended up in Chengdu.
It was like it was a
Snoopy.
command that had come down, and there was this, like, he said this in a very pretentious way, and I kind of let it, and there was a silence, and I said, so how is Xi Jinping's health? And then he started laughing, but his advice was like, try Sichuan, because you go across the border and maybe things will be different. In a bureaucracy, sometimes it works like that. And so I started looking at other possibilities in Sichuan, which was actually, when I went to Fuling was part of Sichuan. But it was, they changed that in 1997. And it was right. I mean, I was able to find a position there in Chengdu, and that was close enough to make trips back to Fuling.
Yeah, so the physicality of the students struck you most. But what about the different generation? I mean, when you first went to China, it was 1996. It was a completely different Sichuan province at the time, right? And when you went back in 2019, those students, from reading your book, they had completely different nightmares and dreams. Tell us about some of these students.
The young ones at Sichuan University. Yeah, I mean, as I said, they were pretty much all urban kids. So, whereas in the first cohort was almost all rural, and at the time they were born, it was the country's population was 83% rural. China was still an agrarian country. China became majority urban like in what year was that? 2011 or something like that. And so of course people continued to move to the cities. And so when I taught by the first semester at Sichuan University, I think I didn't have one student from the countryside actually. Yeah. A couple of them had lived with grandparents at different times during their childhoods in the countryside, but none of them had gone to a rural middle school or high school. So the urban people, they were pretty much all middle class, whereas the first group definitely was not middle class. And they were only children,
Right.
So this is totally different. In the old days when kids came out of the farms, they often had 3 or 4 siblings. Yeah. My last semester, I remember surveying one class of about 20, and there was only one only child. The one-child policy didn't really affect the urban people yet. I mean the rural people in the Fuling years. But the kids at Sichuan University, almost everybody didn't have siblings. And actually, when I surveyed them, I learned that when I said, "Do you have siblings?" I would ask that question. A lot of them would say, "Yes, I have 3." And then I'd follow up, and I realized that they were talking about cousins,
right?
Because cousins were kind of considered, that's kind of almost like a substitute. Yeah. So I learned when I asked that question, I had to say, by sibling, I mean a brother or a sister, not your cousin. So that's showed how rare it had become,
that's right.
for that cohort.
Yeah. Some really interesting personalities. Serena, who signed up for your class, and she was not accepted initially, but she turned up anyway. Yeah. And then later on, she sent you email.
Yeah. So the first semester, so I was teaching in the institute that you mentioned, Scoopy, and so half of my students were coming from the institute, and then they told me you can open it up to others, and it's kind of up to you how many, and so I ended up taking like 30 total, which is way more than you want in an intensive writing class, but I wanted to make it available, but I couldn't take all the kids who applied, so students applied, and Serena was one of the ones who applied and didn't get in. But then she showed up anyway, which I didn't realize actually. And I guess she just, you would have thought maybe she's hiding in the back, but she actually sat right in the middle. And
you didn't notice?
I didn't notice. It was actually the first day that I taught the class, there were a whole ton of people showed up. Like just random people from Chengdu, who had heard that I was teaching this class. And so then they had to try to start managing this, and I was a little overwhelmed. And, so anyway, Serena, I didn't notice Serena. And then she wrote me this sort of amazing email after a couple weeks that like I have been sneaking into your class and she like quoted Shakespeare and is this sorry, and I actually wrote an email to her saying, hey, sorry, and she asked, can I audit the class? And I wasn't allowed to take auditing students, and so I started to compose an email saying that, you know, I'm sorry, can you apply next semester? But then I kind of reread her note and I was like, oh, you know, I've got to let this kid in. And maybe I was, you know, actually when I was a student at Princeton, I went to Princeton wanting to be a writer. And I applied to the introductory fiction course, which is one reason why I wanted to go there, and I was rejected the first semester. And every semester I would apply, and this, you know, Toni Morrison was teaching there, and Joyce Carol Oates and Russell Banks, this amazing faculty. And every semester I would go and look at the list of students who had been accepted, and I was rejected for 3 straight semesters. So maybe I had some sympathy for Serena, because I didn't get into my 4th try. And you know, something about her persistence, which is really a big part of writing, to be honest. Like, part of it is sustaining whatever dream you have. But she was amazing. I mean, she immediately sort of showed how bad my judgment was, because from the beginning of that class, she was perhaps the best writer and certainly really dynamic and an incredibly good reporter as well. And was very outgoing. You know, she did a big project on the Catholic Church and a really interesting retreat that they had, which I'm sure was not approved by the party. And she also did something on a gay bar that was really fascinating. And so she was very dynamic and a great presence. Yeah.
She also played a role in this student magazine called Common Sense.
Yeah.
Later on, right?
Yeah, Changshi. So it's one of the very few independent student publications in China at the time. No contact with the party, and it was this sort of funny thing. You know, that actually nobody ever applied to my class saying that they had written for Changshi, because you never told anybody, and they didn't use bylines. They would use fake. Actually, one of the bylines was the name of somebody's cat, you know, that they would put on there. But they were this funny, and over the semesters they would reach out to me, and I would attend different events, and I got to know some. They're really, really interesting group, and there were a handful of universities that still had this. None of them in Beijing. Like, Beijing was too political. I think there was one in Fudan, in Shanghai. There was one in Zhongshan. So these were like good universities that were not close to the center of power. Right. And Chengdu sort of fits that. Sichuan University fits that description. And they would do, you know, fairly aggressive stuff. Like, they would cover events on campus. And it was interesting. Serena ended up working for them. Writing for them, and she was really energized by it and liked it. And she used to tell me that everybody is either woman or gay, or both. But it was really interesting, because, I mean, I felt like it sort of reflected the fact that people maybe who weren't to have a traditional relationship with power or with authority, they were more likely to sort of push the envelope. They were brave also. You know, these were people, and they didn't tend to be in the journalism school, because the journalism students tend to be a little bit afraid of getting caught associating with this publication. But there was a neat group of people, and I would meet them periodically throughout the time I was there. And like Serena did stories, like there was a student who died suddenly in his dormitory, and that was not reported in the state press, and she did a story on it, you know, reported people. And it was clear the university had sort of paid off the family not to make trouble. And so they were pushing as far as they could push.
Serena. My favorite character is a guy who shared the same first name with me, Vincent. He's kind of gun-loving, America dreaming at the time. And tell us about his story.
I mean, he was a very charismatic and outgoing kid. He was one of these ones who was bigger than me, he was always engaged in class and talking. And he first jumped out at me because the paper, the first assignment was a personal essay, and his was called like A Day Trip to the Police Station. And it was about the internet police calling his parents and like, we need to talk to your son. And then the family, like, what do we do next, right? What's going to happen? And the advice, and he went to his father's advice. He's like, deny everything, you know, because he had bought an air gun that was not legal in China. And his father's like, just say you were cheated, you weren't happy, you threw it away, you know. And so it was this fascinating glimpse of what this is like. And he described it. And the thing about it was that it was just like it turned out that he was actually being investigated more for stuff he was doing, accessing online, and some software had downloaded like terrorism videos onto one of his accounts. And so it was this sort of kind of terrifying, because people go to jail for things like this in China. But it was described all in this like very casual way, like this is just normal, you know, chain of events for a 17-year-old kid. And you know, the father's advice at the end was like, I hope you learned your lesson. Nothing's private. They can see anything anything we're doing. And Vince, at the end of his essay was something like, just know Big Brother is watching, so it was really, so he really jumped out because of that paper.
That resonates with what you were teaching them at the time, George Orwell, Animal Farm.
Yeah, we ended up
reading, right?
Yeah, we were doing Animal Farm in that class. A lot of the kids had already read, Orwell gets read a lot in China. It's sometimes surprising to people. It's and then we ended up doing that semester.
Right. I remember Vincent is so interesting and thoughtful. When COVID struck, he actually reflected on, how China dealt with COVID, et cetera, right? And then he was transferred to Pittsburgh School here in Pennsylvania. And what happened to him? He was converted to Mormon church and then converted again to a different religion, was that right?
Yeah, so he was not an ideological kid. So he wasn't somebody who, he was not like an activist type or dissident type as a student, but he was very open-minded and curious, and he thought for himself. And he described himself as individualistic, which and a lot of the kids would say, we're more individualistic than our parents, and that was true. Like, they definitely had more qualities that I would associate with individualism than I remembered from the earlier generation that I taught, which was basically the generation of their parents. So, COVID, he wrote this really thoughtful essay about COVID and how angry he had been at all the stuff that happened in Wuhan with, officials lying and covering up what's going on, the whistleblowers who were getting detained and threatened and punished in various ways, and how angry he had felt. But then how after the next phase, when the policies began to be controlled effectively in China, how he changed his mind and he became more positive. And he actually said at one point, I think socialism is better for handling things like this.
Yeah.
So that was his conclusion and at the time he left for the U.S., that was his feeling. And he changed again after going to the U.S., partly because of the way COVID was handled later in China, when the zero COVID was sustained for much longer than it should have been. Yeah. But I think also just thinking about his future and what kind of life he wanted to have, and he just decided that he felt like he would rather stay in the U.S. Of course, he also started acquiring all kinds of guns, which was something he had always planned to do, and he was perfectly happy to do in the U.S. So he was an interesting figure because he sort of challenged. I think he challenged the typical New Yorker reader who sympathizes with this kid who's had this scary experience with the government, the internet police and everything. But then he comes to the U.S. and he's like, yeah, I'm free and I'm going to buy as many firearms as I possibly can.
It's interesting because, these one-child generation, these kids you later on taught in 2019 to 2021, they were basically in the same province, same place geographically with your previous students, right? Your previous students were like Emily, the student north, and another student who is called May, whose husband unfortunately had cancer. You kept in touch with them, you ran a survey with them, and then when you were in China, you were still visiting them. Looking back 25 years, that period of time, a quarter century, how much change have you detected from their lives?
Yeah, so when I left Fuling, I collected all their addresses, which was a fortunate thing, in that I had these books where they wrote kind of farewell messages, and each of them wrote their mailing address. And that turned out to really be necessary because people didn't have phones, didn't have internet at that time. And so we started a correspondence, which was also easier because I moved to Beijing and not too long after leaving Fuling and became a freelance writer. And so it was easy to exchange letters, and we would exchange these, in the early days it was all handwritten.
Yeah.
They would handwrite letters and I would type up letters and send. I'd send one every semester, and it just was something I did as part of my life in Beijing. And they were starting out their lives as young teachers, most of them, and going through all the things that young people go through, marriage and so on. Yeah. And they would write me these incredible letters about what they were experiencing. And so this correspondence, and over time I realized this is unusual, this is a neat, I can stay in touch with this cohort of people. And I began to be more systematic about it, in that, especially once my books were published in China and all of them had read what I'd written, then I started to do surveys with them, where once every year I'd ask them a series of questions, different topics. I did one on government, their views on politics, one on faith and morality, I did one on economics. So I'd kind of choose topics and ask them questions. And because we'd had this long communication and we had a high level of trust, they were willing to participate and would be quite thoughtful in their answers. Yeah. So it was really important to me one thing in terms of staying in touch with what's going on in China, but also just getting to know this group of people, and trying to get some, because as you mentioned, the lives change so much. Sometimes it's hard to understand. It's overwhelming, right? I mean, that these folks came out of the villages, came out of poverty, and then they pretty much all are in middle class. They have apartments, they have cars. It's hard to track what that means. And having this correspondence helped me make sense of it at the human level. And one thing that was fascinating to me was that so many of their ideas that to me I would think of as rural survived. Like their divorce rate was extremely low, even though China's divorce rate really went way up for this generation. But these individuals, I think, I asked that question twice, and both times there were more than 30 respondents and only one was divorced.
Right.
And often they would say things like, I don't have enough money to get divorced. Or they would say, I'm a traditional man, I came from the countryside, we don't think divorce is a good thing. So they continued to be sort of, traditional from the values they had that they were raised in.
Even though when some of them got married, they wrote to you, one of them said, last winter I was married with a doctor. He is not very handsome, but he is very kind to me. And next spring we will have a baby. The second one said, what makes me happy is that I married an ugly woman who graduated from the maths department of Fuling Teachers College, right? And the third one, which I thought was really funny, said, now I found a girlfriend. She will be my wife after 2000. She isn't beautiful. There are many black points on her face, but I love her because she has more money than me. Maybe I love her money more. I have many more things to say, Peter, but I cannot write out. This letter is typed from my girlfriend's computer.
Yeah, you get these amazing, amazing letters. That was one of the first ones that was typed. And those were also qualities that I associate with rural Chinese. And it was kind of a joke when they were young. If they had a girlfriend, we'd always say, and they show a picture. Oh, she's very beautiful. No, she's very ugly. There was just like a knee-jerk that you had to say that. And it's
modesty. It's
modesty, and it's also like a way, if you take too much pleasure in something, it could bring bad luck. It's a little bit like, you lived in Egypt, like the El Ain El Hasu, the evil eye, that the people in the Middle East believe that you have to kind of keep bad, you don't want people to be jealous. You don't want people to envy you. That's going to bring misfortune. Right. And so there was some of that quality. But they would just be incredibly, and the same thing with the child. Oh, your daughter's very, very smart. No, she's stupid.
I mean, some of your earlier students, Emily, I thought she's just a wonderful, wonderful woman. She's got a son called Tao Tao, who is also at school right now, right?
Yep.
Tell us about Emily's story, because she also was featured very prominently in your previous works.
Yeah, I wrote about Emily a lot in Rivertown. I mean, one thing that was unusual about Emily was that she was, I think, the only student who read all of Rivertown actually before it was published, because I wanted a local response, somebody who lived there, and I knew that she was really remarkably thoughtful, and it was really fascinating, that kind of exchange when she was reading it, because she was often sort of ashamed by it, because in Rivertown I described the town as being remote and poor and the way it was in those days, and she said, I know it's true, but I'm not always comfortable with it, and you could kind of see that sensitivity, that having lived through this era when China didn't have much was a painful thing. And it was really great to have this communication with her. And I was just starting out as a writer, so it made me think a lot about how to write about China and how to describe people. And I stayed in close touch with her. She went to Shenzhen and was a migrant there, working in a factory, and I visited her there many times and wrote about her experiences. She ended up going back to Fuling. And she did quite well. She was a teacher. She married a man who was a manager in the factory, like kind of a technician, but very high skilled, and he did well professionally. But her family suffered because her younger brother killed himself. He was a young person he was very highly intelligent and was a good student in many ways, but always suffered kind of from being bullied by teachers and students. And as a young man, sort of had trouble finding his path in China. And she commented once at one point while he was still living, he is a victim of modernity. That just he doesn't fit with this society. And this, it's another time she wrote, when we were talking about another suicide, she said it's like somebody has gotten off the fast-moving train. People don't have time to think about that person.
Yeah.
Once they've gotten off, you don't think about them.
Yeah.
So this was obviously just an incredibly painful thing that we didn't talk about that directly for a long time. It was interesting, the moment that she began to think about it differently was when her son heard from another relative about this. She never mentioned it, which is very common in China, that you wouldn't mention this kind of awful event. And Tao Tao asked her, what happened with my uncle? And, Tao Tao is very direct, like he's very smart and he's very much like Emily.
Yeah.
And she realized like she couldn't lie to him and she had to tell him, and, but she found that talking about it helped. Like she could talk, and she talked about why she loved her brother and what was great about him. And she felt like, we didn't know how to handle this. We didn't have the support. He needed people who would listen to him and talk to him, and we didn't understand that at that time. There was no psychological help in China in the early 2000s in a place like Fuling, like very hard to do that. And she found that really made her feel better. I mean, she was very generous in letting me write about this in this book. I mean, I wrote her and I said, because actually I did a New Yorker story once where she referred to it and I said, are you comfortable? And she's like, I don't think I'm ready for this. And I said, that's totally fine. I don't need to write about it. And I didn't. But she felt like, she's like, there's nothing shameful about this. Yeah. And I honor my brother, and, his story matters. And so that was, it gives you a different side, right? Because you have this incredible improvement in so many people's lives, but you do have the people that got off the train. You do have the people that things didn't work out. They didn't ride the boom. They suffered in one way or another.
Yeah,
and it's important to remember those stories.
Yeah, exactly. There's another character, Lu Yong, May's husband, who unfortunately had a lung cancer, right? And you also described, when you met him, and he was very optimistic, always struck a very positive tone. How are they now? How is this family?
It's kind of amazing because he was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and of course this generation, I comment in the book that like when I would go back and meet with the Fuling students, the women often look great, and the men look a lot older and a lot more age. And it's like for their generation, there was a lot of drinking, a lot of smoking. Even if you're just a teacher, certainly the ones who were doing business, but even as a teacher, there was just a lot of networking that was part of the job. And you could really see the impact on it. And they would write about it. Some of them would say, I have to take medicine all the time, and I try not to drink, but my colleagues they kind of bully me if I don't.
The peer pressure.
Yeah. And Lu Yong was, he was the first one I knew of who got diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. But amazingly, there was an experimental treatment that's worked for him. And, but he was also the way they handled it was very characteristic too, in that they were very calm about it. They remained optimistic. And they were actually quite open about talking about it. It wasn't something that they tried to hide. Sometimes people don't like to talk about it. Yeah. But yeah, the last time I corresponded with him, he's still doing okay.
That's great. 2019, you went back to China, went to teach, and then shortly after, COVID struck. And tell us about this experience, because this featured very prominently in your book. The entire second half of your book, half of your book is about your experience in COVID, including, how your daughters, Cai Cai and Roro, how they experienced COVID. Tell us about this.
Yeah, I mean, this of course was not part of the plan, and I mean, we were lucky in a lot of ways because we had originally thought about maybe delaying a year, and if we had done that, we never could have gotten in because in 2020 you couldn't go into China, and we were there for 6 months before COVID hit, and I remember that in December starting to hear reports of something possibly in Wuhan, and Leslie and I both thought, oh, it's nothing, and we were so we were still so intensely dealing with the transition that we didn't think about it that much. And then suddenly it was there in the sense that the town was locked down and people were being evacuated, foreigners that we knew. The embassy sent all non-essential personnel. The consulate in Chengdu sent all their non-essential personnel back to the United States. And people were asking us, are you going to stay? And that was a decision. But I mean, it was mostly actually, we made the right decision for the wrong reasons, which is that we stayed, but it was mostly because we didn't think it was that serious. But it turned out that it was better to stay because Chengdu was never hard hit. And we did have a lockdown, which at the time seemed like crazy. It was like a month, but we were able to leave and go for walks and things, but it was just a month when pretty much everything in the city was closed. But then it was kind of done. The last reported case in Chengdu was February 20th. I wrote an article about this. The first time we went to a restaurant was March 8th,
right.
2020. So that's kind of when it was starting to hit here in the U.S.
Yeah.
We were sort of done with it for that phase. And my kids, it took them a lot longer to put kids back in school than they should have, but my daughters were back in school in early May, and everything was normal there. But it was strange to be, and also so many foreigners had left, and we couldn't go in and out at that point. Like if we left, we weren't going to be able to come back in. So it ended up being, in some ways, similar to Peace Corps. In the Peace Corps, I was in China for 2 years. I never left. And this era ended up being the same because of COVID.
Yeah. COVID, during that period, there was also an unfortunate episode of deterioration of the U.S.-China relations. And somehow your daughters were also caught up in it, right? Students began saying, Americans are bad, these things. But there's this teacher Zhang, tell us about her. So she gave a speech to the students and say, use the example of Elon Musk.
Yeah, Elon Musk was a little different in 2020 than now, I think, in terms of how the speech could. But I mean, basically, my daughters were back in school, and that must have been the fall of 2020. And they went to a public school. So they were in a Chengdu public school with 2,000 students, and they were the only Americans, and there were no other Westerners. It was not a school that had traditionally accepted students from foreigners, basically. And they didn't speak Chinese when they showed up either, so it was a big transition. The school was amazingly open to take them. It took us a lot, we'd spent a lot of time meeting with the school and saying, we're going to support them. We'll make sure they get tutoring, and I think we think they can do this. And it was amazing that the school let them in the first place. And then COVID hit, and I kind of wondered if they were just going to say, you can't be here anymore, because there are all these new controls and tests and so on. But they never caused trouble in that sense. The school welcomed them back when the kids went back. But there was a period, I think that was in the fall of 2020. No, it was in the spring of 2020. It was after the George Floyd, death in America, and this kind of period when the pandemic was going very poorly in America, and there was a lot, and all the fights with China had heated up, all the rhetoric between Trump administration and the Chinese, and there was just a lot of anti-American sentiment on the news and the press. And Ariel and Natasha came back from school a couple times and said, some of the boys are kind of teasing us, and they're saying "Da Dao Meigo," which is like down with America. And Les and I said, this is a tough time, and most of the kids will continue to be great, and you can deal with it, just ignore it. We didn't complain to the school. I felt like it wasn't that serious, and I felt like this kind of thing was probably bound to happen. But it was interesting because the teacher must have noticed, and the next day in school, she gave this speech about Elon Musk, because his rocket had just gone up, the first one, and she talked about this achievement and how he was an immigrant and had come to America, and how the science education was really good there, and this helped contribute to this achievement. And then she said at the end, every country has its good points and its bad points, and that was her way of, kind of diffusing this. Yeah. And it was amazing. They were very decent throughout. I felt like my daughters were very vulnerable, obviously, and there was just this high level of decency in the way that the school handled this.
Yeah, and by the time you left, when Teacher Zhang bade farewell to you and your family, she said very profoundly, these are 2 very long years, right, by the time you left. Yeah, but, in the end, Tyson and Roro, they turned out to be fine, and they had a great time at school, etc.
I think they're fine.
They were fine, yeah.
Zhoro is actually here, so she may have a different read on it.
Hey.
She may feel differently about that. But.
Right. Shout if you don't agree with your dad. But you were caught up in this whole kind of geopolitical madness yourself, right? You were at one point you were jubailed by a student called John, and what was your experience? How did these things play out?
Yeah, you're referring to the jubao, which means to be reported, and there was an incident. Actually, this was before the COVID thing happened, at the end of my first semester, where just some stuff appeared on social media that I had been saying things in class that were politically incorrect, and that I was being reported, which is a big deal in China. You can be reported for all kinds of things. It's very unclear what can trigger this. And there are professors. It doesn't happen all that often, but when it happens, the consequences can be significant. And it's something that professors are definitely aware of and frightened of. And this was a weird incident because I could tell that the comments had been on a paper that a student wrote on my editing. It wasn't, these were editing comments I'd made in a paper. But somehow they had been kind of twisted, and then it was posted first on a bulletin board, and then it was on Weibo, on the Chinese version of Twitter, and kind of made it sound like I had this class where I was browbeating the students in a very anti-China way. So there's sort of a fabricated thing, but I could tell the details that it came from one student's paper.
Right.
So it's something frightening. Like, I wasn't really sure where this had come from. I wasn't sure if he was responsible, and nobody really seemed like they wanted to know. Actually, I mean, the administration didn't do like a full investigation. When they met with me and I talked about what happened, they said, well, nobody has formally reported you. As far as we're concerned, this is okay. Let's move on. Right. And so you could see that this kind of fear, like they were afraid of getting trouble from upper levels if it becomes like a story or something. But they're also afraid of what the students might do. And I really could sense that. This is part of the general political tension in China at this time, that you have these sort of people, everybody's afraid at some level. And so I never found out the truth of it until later, after I went back to the U.S. and I contacted that student and spoke to him about it. And I kind of...
What did he say?
He said he hadn't been aware of it.
Oh, interesting.
Which I believed, actually, and I believed in his response to me. He responded very quickly when I wrote him. He said he'd heard that there'd been sort of a reporting incident, but he had no idea what it involved. And actually, by this point, I had talked to other classmates of his. When it happened, because I had to teach them the next, 3 days later. And I had this class, and I remember being so nervous. And I was supposed to teach them Orwell, of all things, and which I put off for another class. But I was, so nervous, and I couldn't tell, was he behaving in a guilty manner? Was this kid watching? Was that? And some kid made a comment that to me seemed loaded. But it turned out later that, because I talked to some of the students, and they were pretty much oblivious. Mm-hmm. And what I could tell, a lot of them said, yeah, I heard something about it, but I didn't look into it. And they kind of learned, don't mess with this. Mm. It's one of the lessons, right? If this is going on, why ask questions? Why worry about this, right? It's just going to cause trouble. Stay away from it. Mm. And I think that was part of what their reaction reflected. But when I spoke with him, I felt like I think he was telling the truth. But because one thing he told me was yeah, I wasn't happy about your editing comments. I understood where they're coming from. But I just don't agree because I'm Chinese and I have different ideas on this. And the fact that he was so direct about that, I also found it felt very honest to me. But he had mentioned them to some of his roommates and some friends. I see. And this is what actually, because other people had told me this might be what happened. Right. When I talked about this, they said maybe somebody told somebody. It's like telephone, right? And then it came out and this got blown up on social media. Right. But it kind of reflected this general tension in the political atmosphere that things like this can happen and scares everybody in a way.
Yeah. Those were indeed very contentious times. And during COVID, you wrote something about how China handled the COVID, and then you also got trolled outside of the country, right? Those of us who cover China will, very much relate to that. You cannot please everyone these days. How did you handle those controversies? Seeming controversies.
Basically by not doing anything. I did, I kind of decided at the time that I was somewhat vulnerable because I was there reporting as a professor, which is not something you're probably supposed to do. Mm-hmm. I didn't have a journalist visa like I had had before. I was reporting because I felt like this was an important event. Large numbers of American journalists with experience had been expelled, and I was there, and I felt like I should write about what I'm observing, and it's important, and this is a public health crisis too. It helps to know what other countries are doing, but in terms of getting into arguments with people, I felt like that would just create more tension on me, and so my decision at that time was I'll just focus on my articles, I'll do the research and write, but I'm not going to make public statements apart from that.
But those controversies, both inside the country and outside the country, somehow contributed to your final decision to leave Scoop in the end, right?
Well, my job wasn't renewed, and I believe that this kind of climate was the reason. I pretty much know that people were nervous, and so they didn't want me to teach again. And I don't know what specifically. There were some people who there was a long attack by a Chinese nationalist that some people pointed to at the time that it was actually right a week or 2 weeks before I applied for the renewal. Some people pointed to that as a possible reason. But I don't think it's that simple. I think it's basically the general climate was so bad and there's a lot of noise on both sides, and people at the university felt like this is going to be a problem if this guy's here.
Yeah, and unfortunately Peace Corps had to come to an end. And I remember towards the end of your book, you went back to the original office and saw the map. They had all these offices, all these volunteers. The original Chinese name, I think it was called U.S.-China Friendship Volunteers.
Yeah, 美中友好志愿者.
美中友好志愿者, yeah. And tell us about, when you went to that office and saw it finally closing down, and you were one of them 25 years ago.
Yeah, and it wasn't because, when I went there in 1996, they actually did not have a country agreement with the U.S. for that Peace Corps program, which there's no other country in the world that had Peace Corps volunteers on the ground without an agreement. I mean, that's really and not a great situation, but it's because the Chinese were so unsure that they wanted this program there. There had been a lot of propaganda about the Peace Corps in the Maoist years, that the Peace Corps was this American government organization that took idealistic young Americans and sent them to the developing world to make it capitalist. Which was basically true, right? I mean, it's kind of like, it's sort of like, I mean, it was a product of the Cold War. It came out of that book, The Ugly American, that the Soviets were beating us at the grassroots. And that was the origins of the Peace Corps. Of course, it had become something different. And those of us who were there in the 90s, we weren't propagandists, and the government wasn't telling us what to teach. And at that point, most people weren't even really aware of that history. But so it had been politically charged, and in those early years, there was always a lot of fear that the Chinese would kick the Peace Corps out, and we were told to be very careful. Actually, I mean, in our group, there was very little dating at that time with locals, and that was partly because of this fear that anything you did that looked bad could cause problems. We were being watched very closely. But it was amazing because when it finally happened, the program ended, it was not because of Chinese opposition, it was because the Trump administration made the decision to pull it out.
And you also interviewed one of the high-profile senators who advocated for the closure of the program, right?
Yeah, Rick Scott from Florida. He was one of the ones Rick Scott and Rubio from Florida had been, for months they had been saying, we got to get the Peace Corps out of, I mean, at one point Rick Scott said, I want by October 1st, which is the 70th anniversary of the founding of China, all the Peace Corps volunteers to be pulled out of China and sent to the Bahamas to help with the hurricane relief, right? Well, I think there probably are some volunteers who wanted to go to the Bahamas, but it was, this is like, you don't do this, right? So like nobody really took it very seriously, but it's amazingly somehow this stuff got traction, and it happened, and it totally broke all the protocol with how you end programs in the Peace Corps. When I interviewed him, I said, did you talk to anybody who'd served in China? And he just acknowledged that he hadn't. He didn't talk with a single former volunteer.
Yeah.
And I said, do you think that this program might have contributed to the State Department, for example, with China experts? He's like, I talked to them, and they said there wasn't a single Peace Corps volunteer.
That wasn't true, right?
Who worked in the state? Yeah, there were 27 currently at the State Department. I mean, just like basic research had not been done, right? And you have somebody, and his view of the Peace Corps was that it was a development and anti-poverty organization, which is not what it's not. It's not a poverty alleviation organization. It's based on the exchange program. It's a way to build bridges, right? And so there was this complete misunderstanding of what the program was about and about the benefits to the United States. And it was one of a series of sort of self-damaging decisions by the U.S. government during the Trump administration regarding China. Same thing with like closing the Chinese consulate in Houston, which then meant that our consulate in Chengdu was going to get closed, or kicking out a lot of Chinese journalists, which meant that a lot of American journalists were going to get kicked out.
Yeah. I wanted, having gone through, you were one of the very few American journalists out there on the ground in China. Having been through these 2 very contentious, long years in China on the ground, what did you learn as a writer, as a journalist, as a longtime China watcher?
I mean, yeah, it was very different than the era I was there before. You didn't feel that kind of pressure. I definitely was frustrated by, not on the ground though. I mean, that was the thing. Like it didn't, as I mentioned, at the school was great. And really my teaching, I had this thing where my job wasn't new, but the students really came through. They did not cause trouble. They were dedicated throughout every semester. I felt like I had very engaged, very diligent students. We had that incident with that student John, but when I talked to them about it, we had a really good conversation about it, and it was, I think, a minor incident. Like so my job was good, and actually even as a reporter, I found it like a period when I could talk to people, and they were quite open with me. I mean, like when I went to Wuhan in August of 2020, and that was a really great experience because it was close enough to the end of the pandemic that people's memories were very fresh, and they kind of wanted to talk about what they had been through. And I found people really amazingly open and generous with their story. So on the ground, it felt great, actually. And I was very happy with that part of the experience. But yeah, the sort of public side of being a writer is very hard at a time like that. And it's very hard now. You know, like there's just a lot of pressure on both sides. Everything's black and white. You know, and they want to see this, everybody needs to see a certain very narrow narrative, and they're not going to tolerate anything else.
Yeah, that's why I think, long-form journalism like this is so valuable, because you take people to what is happening in China and help them, open the door for them to understand the dreams and nightmares of ordinary Chinese people. I'm conscious of time. I think we should open up for audience questions. So if you, a member of the staff will give you the microphone, and if you identify yourself so that P will know where you're from, and please, you.
Hi, thank you so much, Peter. It's a great pleasure to see you. My name is Wei Xin. I'm currently with the UN. One of the things I struck me in your work is that you are just a calm observer of Chinese education system, while most other Chinese scholars here will constantly draw comparison with the US, saying China is like, how differently we do things here in the US. And you're just calmly observing everything without giving a verdict. And that intrigued my curiosity that if I can push you a little bit, would you share your insights about what do you think is the pros and cons in these two education systems? I'm completely educated in China. It's grueling, it's uncreative. But when I come here to live in New York, I never studied abroad before, and I saw kids serving on the subway wagons. I saw kids walking around with some ski masks. And I tell myself, probably those American kids need some gaokao in their life. So I was wondering, what's your take? Because you never tried to make that verdict, which I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we're probably in agreement in that my personal view is that there's strengths of both and big weaknesses of both. And that's actually one of the reasons, my wife and I have tried to find a way for our daughters to have kind of the best of both. We've tried to do that, and that was one of the reasons why we went there. We felt like there were some good things about the Chinese education. I mean, it's so intense. Chinese education is amazing in so many, and it plays a different role than education in America. I mean, when we were at the school, they would have the Jiazhang Hui, like the parent-teacher conference. People laugh because it's kind of notorious, but it's the meeting that you have every semester at the end of the semester where they talk about the class. And they do all the parents at once, and you go and you sit in your child's desk, which means that only Leslie and I were the only couple that would go because we had twins. So we had two desks. Everybody else has to choose a representative. So it's either the father or the mother, and it's not the same, some men, some women, it's not. But it's amazing because they walk in there and they sit, and it's like they sit at the desk, and it's not like they're, just at the desk. I mean, they are like, again, the body language is like the physicality of the classroom. I was really struck by this, like they become children. They become like Chinese students. It's such a powerful thing in the culture that the moment they're in that environment, that they're fully attentive, and the teacher would talk, and we would listen, and there was not one question asked in 4 semesters of these meetings. And all of the discussion, like none of the stuff you would have in an American school about behavior or this or that, it was all just like, let's go through the math problems that gave the kids the most trouble. And they would have a PowerPoint presentation, they'd go through this, and this problem was missed by 7 kids out of 50 on the final, and unbelievable. And the final, I mean, when these guys were in 3rd grade, every semester they would have a final exam that was 100 minutes long. And the language class was 90 minutes. You guys also had, which ones did you? English, you had a 90-minute exam. It's incredible, right? For kids this age, it's like, and I compare it to like endurance athletes. I mean, I'm a distance runner and I've trained, but it's like you can see they're being trained to focus because of the gaokao, like you mentioned. So I admired that respect, and I admired the way people respected the teachers. It's also neat that the teachers at an elementary school are specialists. So the one who teaches language is a language specialist. A different teacher comes in to teach math. In the U.S., it's more generalist for elementary school. So there's a lot of good things about it, but it's excessive. It's like there's too much pressure. You can see that it becomes, too hard for kids. I mean, I mentioned this in the book that one of my surveys, I also do surveys with the students I taught at Sichuan University who are in their early 20s now. One of the questions I asked them last year was, do you intend to have children? And the majority said no. And of the women, 76% said no. And the main reason is they don't want to deal with the pressure of the schools, actually, which is similar to, South Korea kind of has the same issue, right, for similar reasons. I mean, there's other things going on in China, too, about politics and other parts of the environment, but that school thing is a big part of it. So it is a funny comparison, but you would like to sort of have these things somehow mix and get a little bit of both.
That's great. Lady in green. Here.
I'm Giant. Thank you so much for being here. I enjoy every book you have written, and also Leslie's book. So actually, my question is about your experience in Egypt, because in The Buried, and the overall tone I feel is very neutral, as matter of fact, and also there is a sense of upbeat. But in Leslie's book, I just finished, it seems it's more passive. It's very different to what she has already written in The Factory Girl. So I don't know whether it's because you are looking at it from different lens, but it's the same Egypt you two live together at the same time. So I like to hear, how you how you perceive the gender disparity in Egypt and overall the comparison between Egypt and in China. And also, I'm very curious, what is the next project of yours? And if it doesn't put you into trouble, what is Leslie's next project?
Well, you stole my question as well. What next for Pete? Yes, but good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually our views were quite similar on Egypt. I mean, the books are very different focus and so on. But, I mean, both of us loved being there and found the people incredibly engaging, loved learning the language, traveling around there. Our daughters were very small when they were there, and they had good experiences there as babies, basically, because they were 1.5 when we moved there. But we're not very optimistic about the future there long term. And partly that was a tough time because the revolution seemed promising when we showed up, and by the time we left it was pretty brutal, the political situation. But I think the bigger problem both of us saw with sort of these social issues, particularly the issue of women. Egypt is like less than 25% of women work outside the home. I mean, they still have amazingly repressive laws in place about what kind of rights a woman has for divorce and things like this. And I think because Leslie's book was focused very specifically on women, it was bound to be darker, probably. And she had trouble seeing much progress there. And I think there's also, people don't really recognize how big of a problem it is. I mean, I found that interesting talking to Chinese who were there, especially average Chinese. Part of my book I wrote about people from the Wenzhou region in Zhejiang who were totally uneducated, and they were doing trade in
selling lingerie, right?
Yeah,
in
selling
Egypt,
lingerie in Upper Egypt, in very remote places. It was kind of amazing. They found this foothold, but they were always they would just be like, the biggest problem here is that women don't work. They don't leave the home. Look at what my wife does. She works as hard as me. She's as important as me. I mean, and it was true. Like those students that I taught in the 90s from Fuling, there was not a single woman from that cohort who did not have a career as either a teacher or an entrepreneur or something else. They all were very active, very engaged, and you could see it in their relations with their husbands. That they had authority in the family, and it was much more equal. And in Egypt, that wasn't what you would observe. So that was definitely a big, huge difference from China.
Although I have to say, Saeed, the trash collector, the main character of your first half of the Egypt book, his wife is amazing.
There's huge talent.
Yeah.
I mean, it actually was interesting because when I interviewed Egyptian women who worked in factories, because I did spent some time in a Chinese development zone actually, and a lot of women are working. If you just talked with them, and you compared it actually with talking to the young Chinese women that I was talking to in Shenzhen, actually Egyptians often seem more, because Egyptians are very outgoing. You live there, right? I mean, they love to talk. They're totally different from Chinese in that sense. Like, they like to talk, they like to make jokes, they use a lot of gestures. It's very much kind of a Mediterranean culture, and those women would seem incredibly dynamic.
Yeah.
Whereas often the young women you'd meet in Shenzhen or places like that, they might be sort of seem shy or retiring when you first met them. But if you followed them over a long period of time, those the Shenzhen workers went places. The Egyptian women mostly were working to get money for their dowry, so they could enter a traditional marriage and immediately stop working. And so you realize it's not just like this individual and her characteristics, it's everything around. It's all the institutions, it's the family structures, the traditions. Like, you cannot overwhelm that by force of personality.
Yeah.
And so, you know, both Les and I were really aware of that.
Yeah, yeah. What is your next project? And
I've
what
got
is
a-
Leslie's?
Yeah, I've got a project that I'm pretty sure I'm going to do, but I can't talk about it yet. So, yeah. But it's not related to China.
It's got many other rivers,
Yeah.
many other possibilities.
Yeah, and Leslie's starting to work on stuff, but yeah, I certainly can't talk about it. And Roto, don't talk about it. So.
Yes, this lady over there, yeah.
Hello, my name is Xiaole. I read this book 1 week before it's published, and then that gave me some time to ruminate and to think about it. And then, interestingly, I bought your book, Rivertown, a long time ago, but I haven't read it. So when I read this book, I read this one because at that time there's no Audible. I read this one and listen to Rivertown. So this gave me such a big contrast of the writing like 20 years ago or now. So I have the question, because in both Rivertown and I also read Country Driving, you as the author is so lively, so vivid, even you didn't talk much about yourself, but sometimes there's this revealing of your emotion. Like in Rivertown, you said there's like a running competition. You said, I'm American, I may not speak Chinese well, but I will not. Like, I will run the fast. I'm an American who can run. At that time, I feel, oh my God, this guy is so lovely. And then in Country Driving, there's also this revealing of emotion when this little boy was sent to see the doctor, and the doctor rejects to give the real evaluation of him, and you feel so angry about it. So it's these small moments that you were not that neutral, you know, not that calm, that make me feel, this is such a genuine person, genuine author. But then reading this book, I found I couldn't find this guy, because in this book, it's still very calm, very neutral, but it's I was looking for this kind of revealing of emotion through the whole book. I didn't find that much. There's a little bit, because when you talk about the 举报, you did mention I feel nervous and I feel really relieved when something happened. So I was just wondering, like, especially this is during the COVID time, every family experienced so much turbulence and also strong emotions. So I was wondering, like, is that a writing decision, like how to make this distinguishment, or is it just like different life stage? Because at that time you were just a single guy, maybe single, you know, not with family, not with kids, but this is a middle-aged man with job, with kids in the, you know, it's. So what makes the difference between from the previous book to this book? The author, the revealing of the emotion, the fearlessness, kind of retreated.
I think it's the editor's fault. So he took out all that stuff. So no, I don't know. I mean, I guess I don't read it the same way. But you are at a different stage of life. You know, to go too far with the river thing, you never step in the same river twice. This was at a very different stage of life, and I don't know. But I think I definitely felt that it wasn't intense, though, in the way that Fooling was intense. Because in Fooling, I remember feeling very strong emotion. Like, you get very angry in those days often. And if I had written it like as a blog or something as it was going on, it probably would have been unreadable, because there's sometimes you get so upset. But I never felt like that when I was there recently. You have to learn to be calm, otherwise you're going to ruin life for your wife and your kids and everybody around you. So I guess that's the only thing that I would say. Yeah.
Talking about these lovely moments in your earlier work, there was this short kind of description of your experience with matchmaking in China, right? That was really funny, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it didn't work out, but
it didn't work out. We know what happened. Yes, this gentleman at the back.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for being here. So you just mentioned the benefits of a double education. Some of us had the fortune to have a double education. I was born in China, came here as a kid, went back to a local high school, came back for college, etc. And then in this day and age where everything seems so black and white, people like me might feel like they're kind of gray and kind of in the middle and are welcome in neither places. So do you have anything to say to people who have had a double education? What would you hope that they do in this environment? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, when I taught in at Chuanda, when I taught journalism, nonfiction writing, and in that class I would usually give the students a talk about an early German sociologist named, I think it's pronounced Zimmel, Zimmler, who was an early theorist. He wrote an essay called "The Stranger," and the stranger is somebody who's an outsider in the community but is part of it somehow. And so it's somebody who's in the community but not of the community. So, for example, the garbage man you mentioned is an example of that. He goes to this community. Saeed works there every day. He knows a lot, but he's not from that neighborhood. He's an outsider. The Chinese selling lingerie in Upper Egypt are like that. They're in the community. They're part of it. They're working, but they're a little different. And that stranger, people often trust. People will tell the stranger things that they won't tell others. And the stranger notices things that maybe other people don't notice. And I was a stranger at Fuling. I was a stranger at Sichuan University, and somebody like you is a stranger in both places, just as I am. When I live now in a small town in Colorado, and I'm a stranger there too. It's my home culture, but I have a different perspective because I've been overseas. So I think that's always what I told my students is that's a good position to be in as an observer. It gives you more flexibility in your viewpoint, and you can notice things that other people might not notice, and it's something to strive for. I always told them also, look out for these figures. I've often written about them. They're really interesting to write about. They'll tell you something about a community or about a place that you're not going to learn from people that only know that community. So I think it's great. We've been fortunate that there's a lot of Chinese students have come to the United States, especially in the past decade, and who are developing this kind of varied perspective. I'd like to see more Americans doing that in China. We have very few American students there right now. And I think it's because it's really invaluable for our understanding, but also I just think it makes you different as a person. It changes you.
Although I think it's slightly different if you are really caught up in this whole thing, right? A lot of Chinese students these days, if you talk to them, they will say, look, if I study engineering or these things, right? It will be very difficult for me to find a job in the U.S. That wasn't really the case when times were good in the good old days. They feel they're being caught up in it. Somehow they feel, their background from China somehow one day will get them into trouble, and that causes a lot of anxiety. And I think that's still slightly different from you and I, being a journalist, being a different stranger in the neighborhood, observe things because we don't have the skin in the game. We don't have a stake in this, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Gentleman at the back.
Peter, thank you for your work over the years, serving as a bridge between these two cultures. You alluded to this a little bit earlier, in that the intellectual climate now is such that the two places have in many ways stopped being curious about each other. And there's a lot of noise and heat, but maybe less listening than there was before. I'm just curious about how you see the role of someone who does what you do in the current climate, and how it's been like for you to navigate that change.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, unfortunately we're just losing a lot of writing about China because it's very hard. I went back as a freelancer in 1999, and that was a time when, first of all, journalism was in a healthier state economically, and so you could kind of make your way as a young freelancer. And there were lots of bureaus at that time in China. You could find jobs. China was quite open. It was easier to get visas. All of that has changed, and it saddens me. It's very hard for a young person who wants to be a writer to find their path in China. You know, and there's a lot of, I mean, because of social media and internet, you can do a lot of good research from afar, and a lot of people are doing great work on that. But it's hard to get the texture of daily life if you're not there on the ground. I think also if you're doing long distance stuff, it tends to skew elite a little more. You're more likely to be getting elite perspectives. So there's really no substitute, and we have to find some way for people to be there, you know, doing research and writing and reporting. But this is, yeah, so this is it's definitely a challenging moment.
We have time for one more question. Shall we go to the lady at the far back?
Thank you so much. Very lucky to be the last one to ask questions. So my question is just to follow up what you just said. You are a journalist, you are a writer, you're also someone who knows a lot about China and probably has very strong emotions about China. I wonder, in this climate, do you see this book as probably like the end of your writing on China? Or do you feel like maybe like for this period of time, and maybe who knows what would happen? Or do you feel like you're very tired writing about China for many years now? It's good to take a pause and maybe write something else or like explore something new.
It's a different way of asking the same question. What next for you, Pete?
Yeah, well, I mean,
You have to say something.
we had always planned that this period actually we were going to be in the United States, because my daughters enter 9th grade in the fall, and we always wanted them to be in the U.S. for their high school years. So actually, both Les and I have been thinking about this for a long time. So it's not a surprise that we're not going to be living in China in the immediate future. I think eventually there's a very good chance we go back there. You know, I don't know if the political system is, you know, what it's going to be like in 10 years or whenever. But, you know, so I wouldn't expect that this is the end of my writing about China, but it is, I've always found it good to go back and forth about, and to write about different subjects. So, I mean, writing about Egypt was incredibly engaging and challenged me in different ways than China did. And then when I returned to China, some of my perspectives had changed. So I think as a writer, you're trying to stay dynamic. You're trying not to get stale. And you also are reacting to what possibilities are there and what the environment is. And for me right now, I'll be in the U.S. For the next few
Writing
years.
about Colorado politics?
I'm doing some reporting on Colorado politics, but that's not my book project. But
I've tried it once more.
I'm also, yeah, I'm also coaching. I was the middle school track coach in the spring, so that's my side job. Yeah.
Great, fantastic. On that note, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for bringing us those stories of ordinary Chinese people. Thank you, and thank you for coming today. Thank you.
Thanks so much.